8 terrifying true stories of being home alone in Appalachian small towns. Horror Stories Story 1. The footsteps on the back porch. I was 17 and thought I knew what quiet meant. Our house sat at the edge of a long gravel road that didn't see much more than the mail truck and the occasional lost fisherman. Nights out there had a kind of stillness you could hear. Wind in the pines, maybe a far-off dog, the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. That weekend, my parents were across the state visiting my aunt, leaving me with the place to myself. I'd been staying up late, flipping channels, eating junk I wouldn't get away with if Mom were around. It was close to midnight, one of those hours where the air feels heavier, when I first heard it. The slow creak of the back porch boards. It wasn't the sound of something small, not the scurry of a raccoon or a stray cat. This was weight, deliberate, spaced out, like someone testing each step. I muted the TV, held my breath. The sound stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it was my mind filling in silence. Then it started again, 2, maybe 3 steps closer to the door. We didn't have neighbors close enough for this to be an accident. No reason for anyone to be out there unless they meant to be. The kitchen light felt like a beacon, so I killed it and pressed myself against the wall beside the window, peeking just enough to see. The porch light had been off all night, but now it glowed faintly, almost like it was struggling, dimmed by something standing directly beneath it. I couldn't make out a face, just a shape, tall and still, framed in that weak halo of light. For a second, I thought it might be someone I knew, but the longer I looked, the less it felt like anyone I'd ever seen. Then the doorknob turned, slow, like they didn't want to draw attention, but wanted to know if it was unlocked. It rattled, turned harder. The old wood groaned the way it did when Dad forced it shut in summer humidity. My skin prickled cold, and I realized I'd been holding my breath too long. I didn't have a gun. Closest thing was my grandfather's baseball bat, leaning in the corner. I picked it up, the handle slick in my palms, and stood there in the dark, counting my own breaths, waiting for the sound to stop. It did. The silence afterward was almost worse. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, every creak of the house making me think they'd found another way in. I wanted to believe they'd walked away, but I couldn't make myself check. I slept that night, or tried to, with the bat on the bed beside me, the lamp still on. When the sky started to grey, I finally opened the door. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mud and pine. On the porch floor were fresh footprints, edges still sharp, bare, human. They trailed halfway into the yard before stopping in the patch of wild grass where the light didn't quite reach. From there, nothing, just empty space as though whoever it was had stepped off into the dark and vanished. I thought about calling my parents, but what would I even say? I cleaned the porch, tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. But every time the house creaked that day, I found myself glancing at the door, at the knob, at the yard. That night, I locked every window and double-checked every latch. Still, somewhere between waking and sleep, I swore I heard the porch boards groan again, just once. I told myself it was the wind. I didn't believe it. Eve. Story 2. The telephone that rang. Once. It was close to 2 in the morning, the kind of hour where the silence gets heavy enough that you can hear the house breathe. I was sitting up in bed with a book I'd read a dozen times before, more for the comfort of the words than the story itself, when the landline rang once, just once, sharp, sudden, and then nothing. We don't get many calls at that hour. Truth is, we don't get many calls at all. That one single chime crawled under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't like a normal wrong number. It felt intentional, like a knock that stopped after the first rap to see if you were paying attention. I told myself it was nothing, tried to get back to my book. A few minutes later, it happened again. One ring, abrupt silence. I sat there staring at the phone on my nightstand, the cord coiled like a sleeping snake, and decided I wasn't going to sit around waiting for a third. I unplugged it, the plastic jack snapping out of the wall with a sound too loud for the quiet of the room. That's when I heard it. A faint clicking sound from the other end of the house. Slow, irregular, like someone tapping a fingernail on glass or flipping a switch back and forth. It was distant, but deliberate. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards cool against my feet, and padded down the hallway. The sound grew sharper as I approached the kitchen, echoing strangely in the dark. The wall phone was hanging there, its receiver swaying gently on its cord as though someone had just set it down. I live alone. I hadn't touched that phone all day. I stood in my socks on the cold linoleum, every hair on my arms standing on end. The swaying slowed, then stopped, the silence pressing in around me. I reached out, hesitant, and touched the receiver. It was warm. Outside, the single streetlight that keeps the corner from going pitch black flickered twice. The timing made no sense. It felt connected, though I couldn't explain why. In the second flicker, the kitchen seemed to grow larger in the shadows, the corners stretching away from me. The clicking stopped entirely, and that absence felt worse than the sound itself. I put the receiver back in place, the small click of it fitting into its cradle sounding far too loud. My eyes kept drifting to the window over the sink, where the glass reflected more of the kitchen than it showed of the night outside. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in that reflection, a shape that wasn't me. But when I turned, the room was empty. I told myself to go back to bed, pretend it hadn't happened. But as I stepped toward the hallway, I heard the faintest muffled hum. Not from the phone, not from the fridge. Lower, deeper, as if it were coming from beneath the floor. I froze there, listening, until it faded so gradually I wondered if I'd imagined it. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound the house made felt magnified. The shift of the rafters, the sigh of the wind through the siding, the faint tick of the cooling pipes. Somewhere around dawn, I drifted off, only to wake a few hours later to the sound of the phone ringing again. This time, it was 3 short rings, close together, before going dead. When I picked up the receiver, there was nothing, just an open line and the faintest static, like breath just beyond hearing. I listened for maybe 5 seconds before setting it back down, telling myself it was just the wires acting up. But as I turned to leave, I realized the phone cord was no longer plugged into the wall. It hasn't been since the night before. Story 3. The kitchen window that shouldn't open. We never used the kitchen window. It had been painted shut years before I was even old enough to remember. Layers of white holding it in place like a sealed tomb. The frame was warped from seasons of damp summers and frozen winters, the kind of old wood that groaned if you so much as leaned on it. It faced the backyard, which rolled down into a line of black walnut trees, and beyond that, the hollow. Out there, you could lose the sun before the rest of town even saw evening. That October night was one of those damp ones where the air feels like it's sitting on you. I'd been in the living room with the lamp on low, just listening to the tick of the clock and the occasional rush of wind outside. I was alone. My roommate had taken the truck into town, and the house had that still, settled feeling that comes when you're the only one in it. Then I heard it, faint but distinct, the sound of wood dragging against wood, followed by a subtle pop. The sound was so familiar I didn't place it at first until I realized what it was. The old kitchen window sliding open. My first thought was raccoons. They'd been bold lately, getting into trash cans, tearing at the compost bin. But even before I reached the hallway, I smelled it. Metallic, sharp, like water pulled from a rusted pipe, or blood left too long in the air. I turned the corner into the kitchen and caught the curtain swaying inward, slow, like it was being pulled by more than the breeze. My stomach sank. That window didn't move. It shouldn't move. I crossed the room, every step loud against the linoleum, and peered out into the pitch. The yard was black, the tree line just a deeper shadow against the dark, but the screen, which had been whole that morning, was cut. A perfect, deliberate X from corner to corner. The mesh edges curled slightly as if from a careful blade. I slammed the window shut, pushing hard until I felt the warped frame bite back, then twisted the lock into place. My hands were damp, but not from the weather. I stepped back to catch my breath, and that's when I saw it on the sill. A handprint, dark with moisture. The size caught me. It wasn't big enough for a grown man, but it wasn't small like a child's either. Somewhere in between. I wiped it away with the dish towel, more to keep from having to look at it than to clean it. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a stray dog pressing a paw against the wood, but the fingers had been long, and the palm was narrow. It didn't fit. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I should have, pretending to tidy, but really just listening. The wind moved through the walnut trees in a slow, rolling hush, but every now and then it felt like something else was moving with it. I left the light on when I went to bed. At some point in the night, I woke up to the creak of a floorboard. Not the ones in my room. These were farther away, in the kitchen. The kind of sound that's too heavy for settling wood. I lay still, holding my breath, counting the beats between creaks until they stopped entirely. When morning came, the lock on the kitchen window was still turned, but the curtain had been drawn back slightly, just enough to leave a gap. And there, faint in the condensation on the glass, was another handprint, higher than the last, pressed from the outside. I never saw who or what left them, but sometimes in October, when the air gets damp enough, I'll wake in the night certain I've heard that old warped frame give way again. Story 4. The lights across the street. I live at the far end of a dead-end road, the kind of place where the only traffic is people who already know where they're going. Across from me there's a house that's been empty for 2 years. The man who owned it died quietly one winter, and his family never came back for his things. They just left it locked up, curtains drawn, and the grass grew tall around it until the township finally came to mow. I got used to it being dark every night, the windows like black squares cut into the siding. That night, I was at the sink washing dishes after a late dinner. The sky had gone from blue to black quick, and the only light was from my own kitchen lamp, pooling yellow over the counter. I was halfway through scrubbing a plate when something caught my eye. In the upstairs of that empty house, a light flickered on. Just one room at first, the far left window that used to be the bedroom. I froze, water still running over my hands. A few seconds later, another light came on, this time in the upstairs hallway. Then, as I watched, the kitchen light downstairs clicked on too. None of them stayed steady. They brightened and dimmed, the way light does when someone walks past with a lantern, casting shadows in and out. I stepped out onto my porch for a better look. The air was still, no wind, no sound but the faint hum of the power lines. The night felt tight, like it was listening. In the upstairs window I could see movement, a shadow pacing, slow, like someone walking the length of the room, turning and walking it again. I stood there long enough for my bare feet to get cold on the boards. Then, all at once, every light in that house went out. Not gradually, just gone. The windows went black and nothing moved. I waited, half expecting them to blink back on, but the darkness held. I told myself it was nothing, a breaker tripping, maybe some wiring finally giving out after sitting idle. Still, I kept glancing through my own window every few minutes until I went to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up without knowing why. The room was quiet, but there was a pale glow slipping through the blinds. I got up, heart thudding, and pulled them back. The lights across the street were on again, but not in any room I could place. It was as if the whole house was lit from inside by something low and swaying, like a candle or flame moving through the walls. I could see it shift from room to room, not in a straight path, but circling, drifting. I stood there watching until I realized I could see more than just light. In the upstairs window, the shadow was back, pacing, but this time it stopped. It stood still for a long moment, and though I couldn't make out a face, I had the awful feeling it was looking straight at me. Then the light blinked out again, and the house stayed dark until sunrise. The next morning, I walked across the street. The grass was wet and soft, and the porch boards sagged under my weight. I cupped my hands to the glass of the front window. Inside, it was just as I remembered it. Furniture draped in sheets, dust hanging in the air. No sign that anyone had been there in years. But as I stepped back, I noticed something on the inside of the glass. A faint smear, like the outline of a hand pressed flat against it from within. It was higher than my own reach, the fingers long and spread wide, as though whoever had been there wanted to be seen. That night, I kept my blinds closed, but I still knew when the lights came on again. I could feel it. The same tightness in the air, like something was moving across the street and didn't care whether I was looking or not. Story 5. The Knock That Knew My Name. It was after midnight, the kind of still midnight you only get when the temperature drops just below freezing and the world outside tightens up and listens. I had the television on without sound, just shapes moving in a blue rectangle across the room, and the lamp at my shoulder made a warm circle on the arm of the chair. I wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody drives up our road by accident. If your tires crunch our gravel, it's because you meant to. So when the knock came, 3 quick raps, knuckle on wood, I didn't jump so much as feel something slide down the back of my ribs and settle there. I didn't move at first. You grow up around here. You learn to wait, to listen. Our houses have more than one way for sound to travel. I heard nothing else. No engine cooling, no crunch of boots on the steps, no wind rattling the branches. Then, clear as if it were whispered right over my ear, I heard my name. Not shouted, not a question, just said, soft and close, like someone leaning near the door to let their breath pull the syllables through the crack. My name. Once. I didn't like that at all. A person calling for help will call for help. A drunk will knock again, will try the handle, will wander to a window. Whoever was out there knew what house this was and who was inside. I set the remote down and put both feet flat on the floor, as quiet as I could manage. The knock came again. Same rhythm, same 3 raps, same pause afterward, like they were waiting for me to answer properly. I looked at the clock. 12, 18, the second hand swept, steady as a metronome I couldn't turn off. We don't have a peephole. You step up to our front window and nudge the curtain with 2 fingers if you want to see who's there. It's how my mother did it, and how I'd done it since I moved back in. I didn't want to. The idea of putting my eye that close to the dark made the back of my neck crawl. But you can't stand still forever. I took my time crossing the room, listening for the smallest thing, breathing, the soft sigh of clothes shifting. But the only sound was the fridge humming and the clock counting out what felt like my last patient seconds. I lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to form a thin line of night. The porch was empty. The rail was traced in frost that caught the light from my lamp and turned it to a quiet shimmer. No truck in the drive, no shadow on the steps. The knock had been real enough to vibrate the glass in the frame, but the boards were undisturbed. And then, because I was listening so hard for anything, I heard it again, but not from the front door this time. It came from the back of the house, 3 raps, wood on wood, as if someone had crossed the porch without touching frost and was now tapping at the kitchen door. I dropped the curtain and turned too fast, the lamp throwing my shadow long and crooked against the wall. There's a short hallway back to the kitchen, just 3 steps, but it felt like the house had stretched while I wasn't looking, the way old places do when you're alone and your heart is beating where your breath ought to be. I stood at the archway and listened. Nothing. Then a quiet scrape, like a fingertip learning the grain of the door. The scrape traveled downward, slow, and stopped where the lock sits. There are explanations you assemble like kindling when you don't want a fire to start. Maybe it's a coon. Maybe it's a kid from town trying a dare. Maybe you left the trash can out and something's curious. But those ideas crumple when you hear your own name again, spoken low and patient, as if the person outside could see you through the wall and wanted you to know they were willing to wait. I reached for the bat I keep tucked between the fridge and the broom, and I didn't think about how the weight of it felt like a lie in my hands. I took the back door the same way I'd taken the front, crooked finger, narrow slit of window. The yard beyond the stoop was a smear of black walnut and dead garden rose silvered with frost. The porch boards where a person would stand were clean, no frost scuffed, no footprints blooming dark. I closed the curtain and backed away, set the bat on the table and stood with my palms flat on the cool wood. The knock didn't come again. The house settled and the clock took back the night, and I told myself it was over. I told myself that more than once before I fell asleep in the chair, the lamp still burning a tired yellow. Morning is a cure for most things that bite in the dark. The sun angled across the porch and made the frost look almost soft. I stepped outside in my socks and breathed the thin cold, searching for what I knew I wouldn't find. That's when I saw the paper. Someone had slid it between 2 boards of the railing, small and folded in half like a note passed in class. My name was written on the outside in neat, block letters that looked like the font on a mailbox stencil. Too neat for a quick scrawl in the cold. I didn't unfold it, not at first. I brought it inside and laid it on the kitchen table like it might leak something onto the wood if I wasn't careful. Maybe I wanted it to say, "Help." Maybe I wanted it to be a prank that would let me be angry instead of afraid. The paper made a dry sound when I opened it. Inside wasn't a message, not the way we think of messages. It was a list, my name at the top, and beneath it, dates. The first 2 were years old, days that didn't mean anything until I realized one was the day my mother died, and the other was the day I'd moved back in. After that, the dates were recent, spaced only a week or 2 apart. The last one was last night's date, followed by the time 12:18. Under that, a blank line, as if waiting for the next thing to be written. I folded it back up because my hands had started to shake. There are people who drive to a friend's house at that point, or into town for a coffee and an alibi. But some stubborn part of me didn't want to give whatever this was the satisfaction of seeing me run. I checked the doors again, checked the windows, checked the cellar hatch. I made coffee I didn't drink, and let the radio play a gospel station low in the background, even though I don't know the songs. All day I carried the weight of that list behind my ribs. When dusk scraped itself along the tree line and the cold came back with it, I turned more lights on than I needed. It didn't feel like it mattered. I tried not to look at the clock, but every time I told myself not to, my eyes would go to it. I told myself I wouldn't be sitting in the chair at 12:18. I'd be standing, or I'd be in the kitchen, or I'd be in the hall with the bat and the phone already in my hand. But when the second hand slid up and kissed the 12, I was exactly where I'd been before, the lamp making the same tired circle on my shoulder, the television quietly moving light without sound. The knock came right on time, 3 raps, and my name followed, kind as a teacher calling attendance. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The next raps came from the back door, same rhythm, like a heartbeat turned inside out. Then the side window where the sink is. Then the thin glass of the mudroom door. Each knock came from a different place, like someone walking the edges of the house, gently, patiently locating the places you forget to watch when you're tired and you've been told your name in the dark. The radio fizzed with static and went quiet. The fridge hummed on, stubborn as a prayer. It stopped after a long time. The silence that followed was so complete it felt wrong, like a stage cleared of actors. I sat there until my back hurt and the lamp was more glare than comfort. Eventually I slept, because the body insists on small mercies. When I woke to a colourless morning, there was a second note on the table beside the first. I don't know how it got there. I don't want to know what I did in the hours I can't account for. The new page had only one thing written on it, the same careful block letters, as if it had been printed by a steady hand. It said, "Answer," and beneath that, tonight's date, the line already filled in. Story 6. The Hallway That Never Ended. The storm came in crooked over the ridge. All wind first and then rain, like a handful of nails thrown against the siding. I remember the way the house held its breath. Lights blinking once, twice, before the power went out with a sound you don't hear so much as feel. A soft click from somewhere inside the walls. After that, it was just the weather and the old bones of the place complaining. I meant to sleep through it. I've lived in this house long enough to know it survives what it's built to survive. But sometime after midnight, I woke up with the feeling that someone had said my name and then swallowed the rest of the sentence. It wasn't a sound. It was a thought that didn't belong to me. I reached for the lamp and got nothing. The dark was full and close, like damp velvet pressed against my face. I waited for my eyes to do their animal trick, but the storm kept smearing the windows with rain and the night didn't offer anything back. That's when I heard the floorboard, not the little pops from wood settling. This was the long, tired groan of a plank taking weight. One step, then the slow release. A pause, another step, far off, down the hall. I told myself it was the house shifting in the wind, that the sounds bunched up different when the power was out and the refrigerator wasn't masking them. I told myself I'd laugh about being jumpy in the morning. But the steps kept coming, patient as someone learning your schedule by heart. One board at a time, each with its own voice, closer, then still, then closer again. I struck a match. The flare felt rude in my hand, bright and hot, and then it gave me the little mercy of a candle flame when I touched it to the wick. The room took shape again, familiar edges easing into existence. The dresser with the warped top, the stack of books I never seemed to finish, the coat draped over the chair like a tired man. I opened my bedroom door and leaned into the hall with the candle held high, expecting to see the end of it 10 feet away, the same scuffed wall where I kept meaning to hang a picture and never did. But the end wasn't there. I can't explain it without sounding like I've made something up. The hall didn't look longer the way a shadow stretches. It looked wrong in a way I felt in my gut first. The candlelight fell and kept falling, calling the next doorframe out of the dark, and then the next after that, as if the house had slid a new piece of itself between my room and the kitchen while I slept. The wallpaper, old, pale stripes, repeated like a stutter. I took a step and the flame smudged in the draft, and I could hear the steps again, ahead of me, faint and careful, keeping their distance like they were walking backward as I moved forward. "Hello?" I said, and the words sounded slow and thick, as if it had to push through water to reach the air. My voice didn't go far. It slid down the walls and died. I felt a boy's embarrassment then, like I'd called out in church. I thought about the cellar door under the kitchen and the way it sometimes drifted open on its own when the pressure changed. I thought about mice and the neighbor's barn cat and the stories people tell about seeing somebody in their house when they were alone that turned out to be grief playing tricks. I held those explanations in my mouth like hard candy, and they didn't dissolve. I took another step. The hall did what it wanted. The candle fattened and slimmed with the air moving along the floor. There's a lot the old folks taught us to read. A change in the wind, the way the creak sounds when rain is coming, the color of dawn telling you what the day will do. I've never known a hallway to speak a language before that night, but I swear to you it was saying, keep back in the way animals lower their heads and pretend it's just to graze. I went forward anyway, not far. 3, 4 careful steps, each one asking the board if it would hold. The walls pressed in then, not with force, but with the suggestion that I had forgotten how wide my shoulders were. I could feel the paper on my sleeve. The stripe under my fingers was cool and slightly raised where the paste had dried in a ridge a lifetime ago. I stopped because the steps ahead stopped. We were both listening. I could hear the small sounds, the wick murmuring, the rain thinning, the storm walking off towards somebody else's house. But under that, a dry sound, the kind wood makes when something drags a nail gently across it. I thought of my father. He used to set a nail on a board and drag it a little, saying, you can tell a rot spot by how it sounds when you test it. I imagined someone doing that to my house, learning the weak places, reading the grain. The nail scratch moved away from me, quiet and sure, and I had the sudden terrible picture of bare feet somewhere ahead, placing weight with the knowledge of which boards cry and which ones keep a secret. I said my name to see if the hallway knew it and wished I hadn't. The sound went out, slow as a fish, and came back wrong. Not echo exactly, more like the word remembered something I didn't. I realized my hand was shaking and watched the flame tremble like it was nervous too. I could smell the candle wax, the old dust the draft had lifted, the wet wool of my own fear. I thought about what was in the kitchen, knives, the back door, the flashlight in the drawer that might not give me more than one weak beam before it failed. I thought about turning and knew if I did I would run, and if I ran I wouldn't be careful. So I took one step back and then another, letting the hall have the space I wasn't sure was mine. When my heel found the threshold of my bedroom, I felt relief so sudden it made me dizzy. I wanted to slam the door, but I knew the way some things don't like the sound of that. I closed it, slow, until the latch touched home with the softest click I could make. The room shrank around me in a way that felt almost kind. I set the candle on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands pressed flat to my knees like I was making a promise to stay put. The steps came back, not closer, just present, the way a creek sounds different when a deer is on the far bank. Every board between me and the kitchen gave a small account of itself, and then went quiet. The drag of the nail moved one last time and was gone. The storm had run down to a thin patter by then. I lay back on top of the covers and watched the ceiling tremble in the candlelight, and somewhere between one breath and the next, I must have gone under. Morning had done what it does when I opened my eyes, took the worst parts and softened them. The power was still out, but the house had returned to its honest shape. The hall stood there like it always had. 10 feet, one scuffed wall facing me, the kitchen doorway beyond. Sunlight found the dust and made a generous mess of it. I told myself I would measure it just to be sure, so I did. 10 feet on the nose, 2 inches shy, the same I'd measured when I moved the rug last spring. I walked the length of it and nothing complained that shouldn't. If you had come by then, I could have shown you the marks on the baseboard, the odd swirl in the wallpaper where somebody had matched a pattern badly years ago, and you would have said, it's a hall, What did you expect? I expected not to find the candle wax spilled in a thin line along the right-hand wall where there's no shelf to catch it. I expected not to find the print on the lower stripe, small and grey, like the heel of a hand had rested there for balance and left its stamp behind when the world was full of rain. I touched it and the paper was smooth, the mark stayed under my finger, not smearing, not old enough to have stiffened. That night the weather was clear, and I thought that would be enough. I told myself to go to sleep with the door open to teach the house I wasn't afraid. I lay there and watched the dark of the hall glow a little with the moon. It looked right, it did. But somewhere past midnight, not a storm in sight. I heard the same floorboard far away that shouldn't be far away, and I felt the house remember its long hallway again in its quiet, patient way. Like a story it tells itself when the lights are down and no one is listening. I rolled onto my side and faced the wall and breathed as if the air were heavy water and I could learn to live under it. I haven't measured the hall since. I don't plan to. Story 7. The Voice. Through the Vent. Our house was older than my parents' marriage, older than the asphalt on the road that ran past it, and you could hear that age in the way sound travelled. Heat rose through square metal floor vents with slats you could angle with your toe, and in winter the furnace woofed on like a big animal and sent its breath up through those mouths. In summer, when the ductwork wasn't moving air, the vents became little wells for cold to collect. And if you put your ear close, you could hear the dark under the house speaking in its own language. The ping of cooling metal, the tiny skitter of beetles, the soft grit sigh of dust shifting when the house settled. There was a vent by my bed, 2 feet from the headboard, a return that led straight down to the plenum and the crawl space beyond. I grew up falling asleep to those noises the way other people fall asleep to cricket static. By the time I took over the place, they were part of what I believed quiet was supposed to sound like. That night, late October and damp enough that the sheets felt like they never dried, I shut off the lamp and lay listening to rain tick in the gutters. The power had flickered once at supper and held, so the furnace ran its steady cycle, and when it clicked off, the absence of its low hum made the room feel even larger. That's when I heard talking. Not a creak shaped like a word. Not the neighbor's TV bleeding through the evening. A voice. Faint at first, then clearer the longer I held my breath. It was coming from the vent by my head, not from above or outside, but from underneath me, somewhere in the crawl space where the dirt is always cool and the air smells like old leaves and pennies. I slid sideways until my cheek was almost on the grate. The metal was cool against my skin, and the sound grew sharp enough to separate syllables. I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't my father's or my cousin's or anyone I'd heard on a local commercial. Gender didn't come through. It was the kind of low, careful tone you use when you're not sure how far your words will travel. It said my address, full, like it was reading it off something. Then it paused, like it had to reach up for the next sentence and pull it down. "Don't lock the door tonight," it said, nicely. Like advice, every part of me went cold in small places. Around here, a person who needs help doesn't start with your address. They start with help. I pushed away from the vent and sat up with my heels braced on the floor, heart thrumming hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I didn't speak. I didn't ask who's there. I've learned you don't invite answers you aren't ready to hold. The voice didn't repeat itself. It went quiet the way a creak goes quiet when a deer lifts its head and listens. Then, somewhere under the floor, I heard a soft brush of fabric against duct, a quick, dry shuffle, and something that might have been a hand knocking, lightly against metal by accident. I turned on every lamp between my room and the living room and took a blanket to the couch, where the floor vent is a few steps farther from where a person could reach from the crawl. I left the TV on mute because light feels like company, even when it lies. I stared at the door until dawn turned the window grey and thin. In the morning, with coffee doing what it could for my hands, I went outside and around to the low hatch. The crawlspace door is a plywood panel painted the same tired brown as the skirting, held shut by a simple hasp and padlock. The lock was there, but the hasp screws were pulled half out, not like a pry bar had jerked them so much as like they'd been loosened and settled back to look undisturbed. I got down on my knees, put my fingers under the panel, and smelled damp earth and something metallic I didn't want to name. A few feet in, I could see where the plastic vapor barrier had been peeled back in a neat rectangle and then smoothed down again. The duct to my room had a thumbprint of grime on it at about the height of a person lying on their stomach. Nearby, an empty water bottle lay on its side, the label half peeled, and the crinkled corner of a grocery bag was caught under a brick, like someone had tried to keep it from whispering when it moved. There were no obvious footprints. Crawlspace dirt doesn't show much, but a little circle had been pressed into the dust where a person might rest their elbow while they listened. I tried to think of ways a sound like that could travel from somewhere else. Voices slip through pipes. Old phone lines sometimes carry stranger currents than they're meant to. Kids dare each other to do cruel little things. All of those felt like thin excuses under the weight of seeing the screws at the hasp shine a little too clean. I put them back in myself, set the padlock in place, then added a second hasp and a longer screw I found in a coffee can on the shelf. I told myself I was being careful, not frightened. I kept the doors locked all day. I texted my neighbor to ask if he'd seen anyone around. He sent back a picture of his dog asleep with its tongue out and said, no. When dusk came and the damp deepened, I stood at the thermostat with my thumb over the switch and thought about turning the furnace off, but the cold would creep in fast, and I didn't like the idea of the house being too quiet to blame. When I went to bed, I pulled the bed 2 feet away from the vent and set a chair against the bedroom door like a person in a story who knows they're being unreasonable but does it anyway. I was asleep when the furnace clicked off at 2-something and the room changed shape. The voice came with the quiet like a moth follows a porch light. My address again, spoken slowly, each number placed like a coin. Then, don't lock the door tonight. It said it kindly, as if it knew I had, and was warning me of the inconvenience that would, cause I swallowed and made myself speak without leaning down, without getting closer to the grate. Why? My voice sounded closer to the floor than it should have. There was a pause, and in it I could hear the smallest sound, a nail or a ring touching metal, moving away and back. He's coming, it said. Not loud, not dramatic, just the way you'd mention a front moving in or a guest arriving early. He has a key. I didn't own a spare key I hadn't accounted for, but my father had. There was a coffee can of old keys in the shed labelled with masking tape, back when the front door was on the other side of the house, back when the lock was a twist latch and trust. I got up and went to the window that faces the shed. The dark shoved its face against the glass. The light over the kitchen sink is on a pull chain. I yanked it, and in the small reflection I saw myself and how pale I looked. Back under the floor, the voice shifted a little farther from the vent, like it had turned its head. "Do you hear him?" it asked, which was a worse question than any answer it could have given. I held my breath until the sound of my blood got loud. I didn't hear another person. I heard the house trying not to make new noises. "I'm calling the sheriff," I said, and the voice made a shape in the dark that could have been a laugh, or could have been silence. "Don't," it said, "he doesn't like lights." The furnace clicked on, sudden and hot, and the voice disappeared under the rush of air like it had never been there, like the duct was only a duct, and I was only a grown person standing barefoot in their own home at 3 a.m, wishing for a dog. I called anyway. The deputy who came out was the tired kind and had the kind of politeness you give a neighbor you don't want to insult. We walked the perimeter. The padlock was still in place, The shed keys were still under their labelled tape. We found nothing but our breath smoking and the sound of the creak like split glass. He offered to sit in his cruiser at the end of the driveway until dawn. Pride made me tell him not to. Fear made me wish I hadn't. When he left, I sat in the kitchen with the phone in one hand and a screwdriver in the other, as if you could dial or pry your way out of whatever is already inside your life. The rest of the night went without event, if you don't count the feeling of being watched by your own floor. In the morning, a breath print clung in a foggy oval to the metal slats of the bedroom vent, as if someone had leaned close from below and spoken gently to the room while the heat was off. I wiped it away with a dish towel and told myself I'd made it warmer in doing so. I haven't slept with the vent uncovered since. I haven't found his key. I still lock the door, and sometimes, when the furnace stops and the quiet pushes up through the grates, I think I hear a patient voice carrying what sounds like a warning from the part of the house that doesn't belong to anyone. Story 8. The photograph on the floor. The kettle had just started its low, patient rattle when I noticed the thing on the living room floor, halfway between the coffee table and the braided rug my mother made when she still felt like making things. It was curled at the edges the way old prints do, the gloss scuffed cloudy from years in a box, only I don't keep boxes out. I bent and picked it up, and for a second my mind made the wrong connection. Some old photo had fallen out of a book, a cousin's postcard, something, until my brain caught up with my eyes. It was my living room. Not just any living room like mine, but mine. The same nick in the baseboard by the stove, the same water ring on the end table, the same hairline crack snaking up the plaster above the mantel. Only the furniture was wrong. The couch sat against the far wall like it had when my father was alive and preferred to watch TV without the sun in his eyes. And the lamp that's been in the back bedroom for years glowed soft by the window. In the corner, half in shadow near the old vent, a figure stood. Not close to the camera, not posed, just there. The suggestion of a shoulder and the angle of a head, as if whoever held the camera had raised it and the person had almost turned and then changed their mind. I sat down without meaning to and turned the print over. No date stamp, no writing. The paper had that dry, chemical feel I remember from my aunt's Polaroids, the faint sweet acid smell like pennies and vinegar. I went through everything I own that could hide a photo, drawers, the cedar chest, the old shoebox I keep receipts in for the year, the kitchen junk drawer with maps to places that don't use those roads anymore. Nothing. The kettle screamed and I shut it up and forgot the tea. My sister would have laughed if I called, said I'd finally inherited Dad's mountain nerves, the ones that made him stand with his hand on the light switch and listen to nothing for long stretches of time. I put the photo on the counter, deciding I'd ask her in the morning when ordinary daylight could make this foolish. I checked the doors, front, back, mudroom, felt the firm bite of the deadbolts, and told myself I was locking out a draft, not anything with a name. Sleep brought the house into that soft focus where every board remembers how to complain. I woke just after 3 when the furnace took a breath and went still and lay listening to old wood and wind. If there were footsteps, they were the slow, dry kind you carry in your head when you want to hear what you're afraid of. I told myself the truth I could stand. There is no one in this house but me. Morning was thin and decent. I stood at the sink and reached for the photo without looking, the way you learn where the knife goes, but my fingers touched nothing. The counter was clean. In its place sat a different print, flatter and newer, the edges still sharp enough to catch your thumb. It showed my bedroom, me asleep in it, turned toward the wall, mouth open in the way you never want to see yourself. The angle was from the doorway. There was a small reflection in the window glass that might have been the camera, or might have been a shape, I don't remember saying anything, but my throat hurt afterward like I did. I took that one to the table and set it down beside the first. The living room had been lit by lamp. The bedroom was taken in the dim, grain clumping the dark into soft clods. The curtains in the photo hung open a hand's width. The curtains in the real room were closed. The door was closed too. I could tell you the obvious things. That I live alone, that I change my own locks every few years out of habit, that nobody keeps a key to my place because I've been stubborn about not needing help. Those facts sat there like clean plates while something else dripped off the edge. I called the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy I knew from school who'd gotten wide around the middle and careful around the eyes. He took his time because that's what you do when someone is trying not to sound like a fool. We walked the house. He ran a big knuckle around the frames, tried the windows, ducked his head into the attic hatch and came down with wristfuls of dust. In the crawl space, the plastic vapor barrier had a neat rectangle peeled back and then laid down again, the way you do when you're too careful to leave a flap. We both saw it and both decided out loud that raccoons are clever. He told me to get a motion light for the back porch and to bring the curtains together tight at night, like advice might be a lock. He told me to switch out the deadbolt, even if I couldn't explain why. I thanked him twice so it sounded like action. That afternoon, I laid flour in a thin veil near the back door and across the kitchen threshold where the light would catch it. I balanced a spoon on the heater vent cover in the hallway so a shift would ring metal. People do these things to feel like they're doing something, and sometimes that is the thing you need. I propped a chair under the bedroom doorknob because my father had, and because he'd always smiled when he did. The smile of a man who knows tricks are mostly for spirits that live inside you. I put both photos in a drawer I could see from the couch. When I lay down, I did it without the TV and tried to make my breathing quiet enough to hear the spoon move. Sometime after 1, the wind picked up. Sometime after 2, the furnace went still. Sometime after that, I half dreamed the spoon chimed, a polite note at the edge of a song. Dawn came slow. The flour looked like nobody had been born to walk through it. The spoon lay exactly as I'd left it. In the drawer with the photos were 3 prints. The first 2 were mine. The third showed me kneeling on my kitchen floor, smoothing a line of flour with the side of my hand, head bent, mouth set tight. The angle was high and close, like from the top of the doorway, or from the shelf above the stove where I keep the pepper and a jar of gravy change. I turned and looked at that shelf and felt stupid and small standing in my own house. If this was a person, they were careful. If it wasn't, I didn't want to know what other category of careful there is. I changed the lock, as ordered. I added a second bar to the back door that lays across the frame. I put a bell on a string and hung it from the bedroom knob. I took the photos to my sister and watched her face sort itself out. She didn't laugh. She said the thing you say when you can't help. You can stay with me. I told her the thing you say when you won't. I'll be fine. On my way home, I stopped at the little hardware store where the old man with the hands like leather shows you screws by weight and memory. He sold me a motion light and told me to set the sensitivity high. He told me batteries lose heart in the cold, same as us. That night, I put the photos face down on the table because I didn't like the way they made the room feel watched. I left the porch light burning, the new one ready to spit white at the least stir. I slept in socks and woke 3 times to nothing. In the morning, a single print lay on the table where the others had been. It showed the back of my head and shoulders exactly as I'd stood the night before, turning the photos face down. The point of view was from just behind me, high enough that you could see the part in my hair and the little worlds of dust lit like stars in the lamp glow. There was a dust-colored thumbprint at the edge of the paper. It fit no one I know. I keep them in an envelope now under a stack of utility bills, as if responsibility could weigh them down. The motion light trips sometimes when no wind moves and throws the yard into noon, and the old walnut throws its shadow like a warning. When I hear the faint choke of the refrigerator kicking on at night, my first thought is a shutter somewhere, and it takes a breath or two to remember what lives in my house and what only visits. I haven't put anything back where it used to be, but sometimes I stand in the doorway and try to imagine the couch on the far wall again, the way my father liked it, the way the photo remembers it, and the room feels almost relieved for a second. Like I was the one who moved things wrong and time has been patient with me. I don't know if the figure in the first picture has visited since. I don't know if I'd know. Sometimes, when the window shows me the part of night that belongs to the hill and not to me, I think about how easy it is to take a picture of someone and how hard it is to give anything back. I still make tea. I set the kettle on gently. I listen to the tiny rattle it makes before the steam rises, like a quiet warning from a thing that knows exactly how hot it is going to get.